Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. For those of you who are new, welcome to the First Saturday PDX program series. We are a monthly program that runs September through June. That's our season. So this is the last presentation of the 2024-2025 season. Um, our program series focuses on Chinese history, traditional Chinese arts, culture, literature, and more recently we started to include topics on the Chinese American experience. So Curtis Chin is the author of the award-winning memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. He's the co-founder of the nonprofit Asian American Writers Workshop in New York, which he did after college. Um, he studied at the University of Michigan, studied writing there, and then went on to a career writing comedy for network and cable television, and then began transitioning into social justice documentaries. He has screened his films at over 600 venues around the world in over 20 different countries. He just finished a European book tour where he talked about the book we'll be discussing today. He resides in California. He's also written for CNN, Bon Appetit, the Detroit Free Press, and the Emancipator Boston Globe. He has received awards from ABC, Disney Television, New York Foundation for the Arts, the National Endowment of the Arts, and many more. His essay in the Bon Appetit magazine was selected for the best food writing in America in 2023. And he has a short documentary entitled Dear Corky, which premiered on the PBS American Masters show recently. He's also currently working on a second book, a follow-up to the book we'll be discussing today, and also a docuseries on the history of Chinese restaurants in America. So thank you so much, Curtis, for being our guest for our monthly program series on Chinese culture. As I mentioned, we typically focus on more kind of the traditional history of China, traditional arts and culture, but we're expanding more and including more topics, especially those related to Chinese American history and also even more local Chinese American history here in Portland. Several of our program members attended your book talk here in Portland in November. It was held at the Golden Horse Restaurant in Portland's Chinatown. And after that book talk, we all crossed our fingers in hopes that we'd be able to invite you as a guest to our program. So we're so delighted that we were able to make this happen. Um, so let me start by asking you some questions on your book. So on the surface, your book is about growing up and coming of age while working in your family's Chinese restaurant. The name of it, I think, was Chung's. And this all was in the 1970s and 80s in Detroit. It's your personal story, and it's in the context of your family's immigrant experience and restaurant experience. But it's also more than that. So during the course of our interview, I think we'll really start to delve into the other contextual things that the book brings up. But to start with, can you share a synopsis of the book, the framework of organizing it, and kind of a general overview of it?
Oh, yeah, sure. First of all, thank you to First Saturday for inviting me to participate in your Zoom webinar. I've done over 300 book talks. Most of them are in person, but the one that we did in Portland was one of my favorites, actually. It was part of a sub-series where I was going to Chinese restaurants around the country and actually doing book talks there. And so I was so excited to come to Portland and do it. So thank you for bringing me back and connecting with some of the people that attended that event. So the book is called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. And as the title says, I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, but not just any Chinese restaurant. I like to think of it as the Chinese restaurant in Detroit. It was just this wonderful, wonderful place that I grew up in. And I started writing the book really just as a way to collect my family memories. My family no longer lives in Detroit. We had to sell the business after my dad passed away. And when my siblings started having kids, I just thought, this next generation of my family is not going to know anything about this wonderful place that we grew up in. And so I really just started writing these family anecdotes. And, after a few years of doing that, I thought like, well, I'm spending a lot of time working on this book. I should probably get paid for it. So that's when I started this publishing journey. But the book is divided into three sections of 8 stories each because Chinese culture is 888. 8 stories in elementary, middle school, 8 in high school, and then 8 in college. But the prologue of the book actually starts with my family's journey from China to Detroit, the Midwest. And the reason I wanted to do that, well, there are two reasons. One is that if you learn about Chinese American history, usually it's centered on, the West Coast, right? Or Hawaii, maybe New York, but you don't really think about Asians or Chinese people being in the middle of the country as early as the 1800s. But that's where my family found ourselves. The second reason is that I don't think you can know a person's journey unless you know the family's history, right? Because so much about the values that you have, the things that you want in life are really shaped by them. And so that is the basic structure of the book. Did you want me to read a little bit from it? Because I usually read the first page of the prologue and talk a little bit more about the family. So this is from the prologue of the book. Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? Armed with a smile and a red waiter's jacket with a perpetual plum sauce stain. That's how my dad greeted any new face that entered the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Interestingly, my great-great-grandpa Gong Li Chin had faced the same question in the late 1800s as he stood cold and alone on a rickety dock in Guangzhou, China, trying to decide his future and that of his young impoverished family. For here to go. For here to go, as I got older, it was a question I asked myself. Starting in our restaurant's long and open back kitchen, where my family made some of our most popular items, including the tangiest barbecue pork and best smelling almond cookies, my mom taught me my first lessons. Before diving into math, English, and geography, she began with a little American history, tales of elders and ancestors, our family as prologue. And so that's what the prologue does. It just sort of follows that family journey. It starts off with Gong Li, who moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing there weren't actually Chinese people there. He decided to move up to Detroit, which at that time was just starting its auto industry, right? There's a lot of things happening there. So he moved up there hoping to find a job. But as you guys probably know from your seminars, the early Chinese immigrants faced a lot of discrimination. And he wasn't able to get a job in one of those factories. And he took one of the few economic opportunities available at that time, which was working in the hand laundry. And he worked really, really hard, saved up enough money to eventually open up his own store. And why that is so significant is because when the United States enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I think you guys have probably been reading in the news if you aren't already familiar with it, it was basically the first time the United States ever banned a group of people from coming to the United States, and they targeted the Chinese. But there were two exceptions to that law, right? The first was if you were a student, and the second was if you owned your own business, because it was primarily an anti-labor law. They didn't want the Chinese laborers competing, you know. To force down wages and things like that. But because he owned his own laundromat, he was able to bring over his son and then eventually his grandson to work in the family business. They kept the laundromat open in the 20s. They opened up a grocery store in Detroit. And then in 1940, they opened this wonderful restaurant called Chung's, which is where I grew up. And the book sort of follows that. The prologue follows that, and it sort of ends in 1960s. In the 60s, at that time, the United States was going through what's called well, we're still in the civil rights struggle, right? But there was a lot more violent back then, where cities were, being really hurt. And Detroit got hit particularly hard, where buildings were being burned down, people were being killed in the streets, and the National Guard had to be called in for 5 straight days, right? They brought in tanks to sort of quell the violence, and they shut down the city. And for the first time ever, my parents had to close the restaurant for 5 straight days. And if you guys know anything about Chinese restaurants, they don't like to close. And so, my parents were forced to shut their doors. But in those 5 days, my parents also found time to have sex. And 9 months later, I was born as their riot baby. And, sometimes people ask me, oh, why do you talk about social justice so much? And I always say, without that incident, I probably wouldn't be around. So I kind of have to do it. So that's the book. It's a humorous look at, a Chinese American family, working in, what I consider one of the great American cities, which was going through a very, very tough time. And despite all the craziness around us, we managed to find, love and happiness and, find our way in the world. And that's what the book's about.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's almost as I read the book, it was easy to read, easy to get into. Humor, you write in a very humorous way. Um, Even on serious topics, there's kind of it it's framed in I thought in a humorous way. But it's like these are serious things going on in the background, in the context. And so that's what's I think kind of fascinating, is kind of the contextual things, in the background. Um, when you just read that passage, you mentioned the phrase, which kind of comes up again and again in small ways throughout the book, like a little thread. That, and that's the phrase, is it for here or to go? Can you talk a little more about some of the things that resonate with you on that theme?
Sure. Before I get into that, though, I want to
Yeah,
address the humor aspect of it, if you
yeah.
don't mind. As you guys all know, we live in a very divided country right now, right? We have these little silos where we don't talk to each other. There's a lot of anger going on. And I just felt like Chinese restaurants are one of the few places where you can go and, have a good time, meet someone from a different, bump into somebody from a different race, class, economic background. And if we just sort of took that opportunity to just sort of lean across the table and say, hey, what are you eating? It's like maybe those are the small baby steps that we need to take as a country to sort of heal these wounds that we have right now. And, you know, it's sort of like the tagline that I used was, come for the egg rolls, but stay for the talk on racism, because these are very serious topics that we're dealing with. But I think we've got to figure out a way to talk about it in a way that actually brings us together and brings us, instills more compassion towards each other, right? Because we're neighbors, right? We should be friendly with each other. We shouldn't be doing all this fighting. So that's why I felt like writing a humor book, but yet at the same time addressing these important issues was what I was trying to do, and hopefully I can contribute to, in a small way, the way literature can, you know what I mean?
Right.
With the pieces. But in terms of the bigger theme of the book, yeah, I mean, so for here to go is the overarching theme in the book. It's a common phrase that you hear just going into any, restaurant, right? In Chinese restaurants, like, hey, for here to go. And I really thought about that for myself, and as particularly as my family came from China and I'd always heard those stories, but also myself as someone who was angsty myself, wondering, do I stay, in Detroit, right? Like with the city falling around apart me, might I also have at some point a need to sort of leave the way that my ancestors made that choice, right? And so that's the push and pull in the book is like, I love my family, I love my hometown, you know what I mean? I love the Chinese food at the restaurant. But at the same time, there might be things that might push me. The other thing about like the starting off with that phrase was that I tried to frame the book as like a visit to a Chinese restaurant. And that's why the opening line is what my dad would say. And then the closing line is, thank you, come again. You know what I mean? And all the chapters are outlined like a Chinese menu. They're labeled like a Chinese menu. So I wanted to have a little fun with the book too. Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah. But so that's where that theme just sort of played in, and it worked out to be a really great theme. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
really guided me in terms of what was the thing that I was struggling with, growing
Right.
up. Is like, when do you decide it's time to go? And you know,
Right. And that's, kind of whether that be small things on a daily basis, the decisions you have to make in life,
it's a pretty
after
universal theme.
college, it's a very universal, right? Decisions about the family business, life decisions and things like that. Um, Talk a little bit about life in the restaurant. I know you come from a relatively large family, you've got a lot of siblings. What were the roles that your different family members had in the restaurant? And like, when did you, I mean, you were born into this restaurant family, but there's some of your like earliest days in the restaurant. Did you have official roles or was it just a place to hang out as a kid? Can I talk about that?
Well, I'm a middle child. That's probably the first thing everybody should know, and whatever that means, like being a middle child. But I don't know if you have anybody else on the group that grew up in a family business. Doesn't have to be Chinese restaurant, could be any family business, right? There's something about it. It almost your whole life is oriented around it, right? Because so much of your life is tied into it, not just your livelihood, but everything that you do. And so that's where everything starts is through that restaurant. And I guess even my childhood and everything was, framed in service to it, right? Like right from the beginning, we were in the back kitchen. Those are my earliest memories. Even before I was old enough to work, I just remember, my grandmother baking cookies or, the adults playing mahjong. You know what I mean? And then, as you get older and you start developing, skills, they slot you in as soon as they can. It's like, oh, you're old enough now to like put the little pieces of almond on the cookie. That's your job now, right? It's like, you know, um, as soon as they can put you to work, they put you to work. They find something for you to do. And I think that's what happened. And as you got older and you became maybe stronger and you could carry more dishes, or you know how to speak, you engage more with the customers. I mean, so they always found a place for you to contribute. I mean, yeah. So being in a family business, so much of it you think is a business, but so much is actually about family too.
Right, right, right. The title of the book is Everything I Learned. So there's, lessons that you have learned from your family or from being a part of the restaurant. And I know that the restaurant has definitely a special place in your heart. What are some of the key significant memories you have from that?
The book is chock full of them.
Uh-huh.
Like, sometimes there's small lessons, like, when you're cooking, sometimes the smallest ingredient, like salt and pepper, actually have the biggest impact, or the fact that, when in life, uh, there's a thing called timing. It's the same thing when you're waiting tables, right? You got to know when to, you know, go get the order, when to bring them the food, when to bring the soup versus the appetizer, first the entree, when to put the bill, right? I mean, that's something you learn, that there's a rhythm in life, right? There's an order to life. But I like to say that the biggest lesson that I actually learned was something that came from my dad. When you're a kid, oftentimes your parents will say, don't talk to strangers. My dad gave us the exact opposite advice. He's like, talk to strangers. And who he was talking about were the people sitting in our dining room because my dad was a kid. He grew up in the restaurant himself. He's a Chinatown kid. He was born in America, but he never went to college, and so he didn't necessarily know what opportunities existed outside of the four walls of that Chinese restaurant. But he knew that he had this dining room full of people who did, right, like college graduates. And so whenever my dad met somebody who he thought just had an interesting life job or just seemed really happy, he'd call all six of us kids to run over and barrage these customers with questions of like, what do you do for a living? How did you get your job? How much money do you make? And this idea of just being able to ask questions when you don't know something in life, to ask for help, when you need help, and just more fundamentally, just being able to talk to people who are different from you is just a skill set that I just feel like has really aided me throughout my life. For a kid that grew up in a Chinese restaurant in Detroit, I've just had these really amazing opportunities in life, and I found myself in really places where I just sort of pinch myself. Like, more recent, like this past tour that we just did, right? Where I did 25 events in Europe over the course of a month. I got to speak at Oxford University. Like, that's pretty big for a kid. Like, I didn't even know what Oxford was until I grew up. I never heard that place, or to be in the White House with the president and the first lady, at a party. I mean, yeah, it's just, or working in Hollywood, I mean, in a studio, working with celebrities. I mean, in any of these places that I found myself, I felt like I could navigate it because my dad had taught me, how to engage with people that were different than me.
Yeah, it's when you think back on our perspective, our childhood or experience as a young adult, we never know what's going to be in the future. We kind of imagine what we think, but we never know. And then when we get to that place, it's like, wow, am I, really here? Is this really happening? But yeah, it's all those things that cumulative give us the skills to navigate that.
Really
Um,
funny. I was just watching this YouTube video with Meryl Streep, and she was like, pushing back against this idea that Hollywood is a bunch of elitist, And she was like, I grew up in New Jersey. I went to the public schools. And then she pointed out that Viola Davis, grew up in a sharecropper's house. And then Sarah Jessica Parker, grew up in Ohio with seven other siblings. Do you know what I mean? She just pointed out that, like, all these people are just really normal people too. We just, for some reason, we just find ourselves within these really interesting positions, you know what I mean? And I'm not equating myself with those people, but in some small way, like, yeah, I'm just an average kid from the Midwest, you know what I mean? I went to public schools my whole life, went to the Detroit public schools. Eventually, our family moved to a nicer neighborhood, so I got better schools, and then I went to Michigan. So I feel like my journey is pretty average, right? But yet, when I take a step back and say, like, wow, you spoke at Oxford. I mean,
yeah.
that's
Well, you might think of it as like, oh, I lived a typical, average restaurant kid's life, but it's also what we make of that. And back to the decisions that we make, coming back to for here to go. And if you choose to go, where are you, launching yourself or taking a step forward in a different, you know,
and hopefully you're prepared when you make that decision. And
right,
like,
right.
I feel like for me, the journey of the book is like, I feel ready now. I feel like my parents taught me everything I needed to know to get on with my life. And that's, that was the journey of the book. It's like, I'm ready now. Thank you, mom and dad.
Right, right. Um, Kind of taking a step back to a little more lighter topic, the importance of food in the
Mhm.
restaurant. From my notes, I see a mention here of like the number of egg rolls that your family produced, or what was the restaurant specialty that was like number one on the menu, or your favorites, or like were you involved in, ever the cooking part, or does the cooking side of it have an interest in your life today? Talk a little bit about the food.
Well, yeah, obviously food has to play a big part of this book. I
Uh-huh.
mean, so when I was writing the book, your agent asks you, well, who do you think is going to buy this book? Who's going to read this book, right? And so I jokingly said, well, for the people of color, we're going to talk about racism. For the gay people, we're going to talk about coming out. And for the Jewish people, we're going to talk about Chinese food. And if I can appeal to all three crowds, I'll have a bestseller. But yeah, no, food was such a big part of my life because you just orient your day by food, right? Like the morning, the shipments come in, the cooks are preparing everything. You serve it, you eat it. At the end of the day, you clean up and prepare for the next day. So food really definitely does play a big part of the book. And I try to have fun with it, and all the different dishes that we serve, having them make cameo appearances popping up throughout, And that was part of the fun part too, like just reliving and we don't have the restaurant anymore, so I don't have access to those foods anymore. But it's like I could like taste it in my mouth still, like the idea of like the almond boneless chicken or some of these other dishes that we had that were really popular sellers. And also, the idea of what I learned from food because the running gag in the book is that everybody in my family knew how to cook except for me, right? Like my grandmother made all the best sweets, even though she was like the meanest person. My grandfather made all the barbecue meats. My dad, who was born in America, made all the best like Cantonese, Hong Kong food. But my mom, who was born in China and grew up in Hong Kong, made all the best, Western food, Italian food. You know what I mean? So it's like, so there was a lot of fun like that. And the lesson that I learned because I couldn't cook, whenever we had these family meals where everybody was like contributing, I was the one that was banished to the dining room to go set the table. And that was frustrating for me as a kid because I always wanted to be in the kitchen with everybody else. But at some point, I realized that in life, you may not find yourself in the place where you want to be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the place that you're in isn't a bad place. And maybe it's also about finding something there, until you can get the place where you want, that you make the best of it. And that's what I did was, because I was stuck in the dining room, I said, you know what? I'm going to be the best, waiter I can, the best front of house. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I think, there are these lessons that you learn everywhere.
Right. All right. You briefly mentioned just now, your grandmother made a lot of the sweet pastries, but she, from your youth was a mean lady, or you know, somebody who was always criticizing or harsh. Um,
Her
and
opening line is Mo Young. I don't
okay.
know if you have Cantonese speakers here, but she basically called us useless all the time. You know what I
Oh,
mean?
okay. Well, and
Useless,
I
useless.
know that when you think back about the older generation and also my knowledge of like more older Chinese history, there's phrases for it's just like instead of calling somebody by their name, it's just like one son or hey,
Oh, yeah.
fifth son, those kinds of things. And so from the Western point of view, that sounds so harsh. Um,
You're
and
just a number.
right, right. Uh,
Yeah, no, no. I was number three. And so, the middle child. And that order placement does affect, the way people look at you. And I do think that, people sometimes ask me, like, you wrote a memoir, like, how did you remember all that stuff? And I said, well, that's because I'm the middle child. No one ever paid attention to me growing up. I mean, whenever anybody came to the restaurant, they always asked about my older siblings or the cute little babies, right? Nobody ever came in and said, "Oh, how's Curtis doing?" And because of that, you are on the periphery, but you're observing everything. You're watching the dynamics. You're paying attention to things. And I think because of that, I did develop a memory, yeah, an
mhm.
image of things. Maybe it was bitterness that caused me to be like, or jealousy or whatever. But either way, I noticed things, right? I really paid attention to the details where, because a lot of times it's like paying attention so you could figure out how you're going to slip in and, get people, how are you going to be part of that conversation? How are you going to be, um, you know, part of that dynamic? So,
Right,
mhm.
right. You briefly mentioned the beginning, kind of the family's immigration story. Your great grandfather on your father's side came relatively early to the United States. In the story, your mother plays a key role, and her story is a bit different. Her immigrant story is a bit different. And there was a chapter in the book towards the end in which she almost wanted, it seemed like when you were going to school to be a writer, that she was like, can you tell my story, kind of thing. And so I was curious to know more about her immigrant story, um, and
Yeah.
the what should I say, the significance of her in the book. And
So, I should clarify that both of my family side came in the 1800s.
oh, okay.
But the key difference is because my great great grandfather on my dad's side owned his own business, he was able to bring over his family. My mom's side of the family, they never owned their own business. And because of that, they always just had to come individually. They could never bring the wives over. They
I
could
see.
never do that. So that shows you how, for the political people in the room today, that shows you the politics of economics, right? It's like
Right.
how families, how some are privileged over others. And so because my dad's side was, had invested in a business, um, yeah, we do. And even if you look at current immigration policy, right? We now, I guess we're instituting a thing where if you have $5 million, you can actually come and immigrate. But if you don't, then tough luck, right? So that's not a change in U.S. immigration policy, and you can sort of see how that played out in my family, right?
Right.
So my mom wasn't born in the United States, whereas my dad was, you know. So anyway, yeah, if you don't mind, I'd love to read the story about that. So I need to set this up for people,
Okay.
if they don't mind. So Detroit in the 80s was a really, really difficult place because of the auto industry really struggling, a lot of people out of work. But there were other factors too, like crack cocaine, AIDS. I always say that, like, by the time I reached 18 years old, I knew five people that had been murdered, including, one of our favorite customers who would come in at odd hours by himself. He's told us he was an ER doctor. Turned out he was actually a psychiatrist who was coming to hire the prostitutes in our neighborhood because we were in the red light district, right? And he wanted to break off with this one girl, and the pimp got so upset that he took a baseball bat and bashed in his head and killed him. And then he took a Ginsu knife and chopped up his body and littered it all across the freeway up to the Northern Peninsula. And so that was my senior year in high school, combined with the fact that, as a closeted gay kid, AIDS was really devastating to the community. Anytime you read anything about a gay person, they were in the hospital and dying, and probably accompanied by some story about how they'd been kicked out by their family. And so at that age, I really didn't think of going to college, right? I didn't understand the value of sitting in a classroom for 4 more years when I literally thought I'd be dead by the age of 30, right? I didn't think I'd have a very long life. So my goal was just to literally travel around the United States, buy a Jeep and just drive around. You know. But my mom, as you mentioned, she had a tough life. She had an arranged marriage to my dad, the stranger in America. She knew nothing about Detroit. She was forced to drop out of high school. And she'd already earned a scholarship in Hong Kong, right? Because back then they didn't send girls to school, right? They didn't pay for it. And so she earned this scholarship to one of the top schools there, right? And so her life was really severely altered by this marriage, right? And so when she got to America, she had this really mean mother-in-law who was just never supportive of her or the relationship, because even though my dad was in an arranged marriage, when he got to Hong Kong, that girl already had a boyfriend. So my dad had to find a wife on his own. And so when he found my mom, my grandmother was upset because she didn't have a say. She didn't get to choose, who my dad was marrying. Anyway, so my mom really didn't like that restaurant life. She didn't like being there. And so she had this one mantra that she would always share with us, which is work hard, obey your elders, and be quiet. That was all she would say to us. Work hard, obey your elders, and be quiet. And when it came time to applying for college, I rationalized what would be me giving up 4 years of my life for a woman who's given up her whole life for me. And so I made a deal with my mom and I said, okay, mom, I will apply to college, but I'll only apply to one school. And if I don't get in, I'm not going. And she said, okay, fine, apply to Michigan. And so I applied to Michigan and sadly I got in. And so I went to the University of Michigan. I was one of those kids that worked full time and went to school at night. I didn't know what I wanted to study, but when you look at the course catalog for evening courses, there's a lot of creative writing classes. And so I just did the math and I said, okay, if I studied poetry and if I only wrote haikus, I could graduate in fewer than 500 words. And that was my whole goal for graduating college. And I must have wrote a really mean haiku because I got into the creative writing program there, which only took 20 people. And so, this is a story from that time period, if you don't mind. Okay. So again, the chapters are all labeled like a Chinese menu. So I don't know if this will make sense to you all, but this is chapter M7. Being a creative writing major made me the literary expert at Chung's. That was inevitable as my dad asked every customer, have you met our number three? He's the writer in the family. Every time he mentioned my program, the number of students accepted got smaller and smaller. At some point, I expected him to say I was the only one on campus even allowed to own a pen. One week, one of our waiters was out sick. My younger siblings were busy with their weekend activities, so I was the one called in to help. I jumped at the chance to have some home-cooked meals for a few days. I was running around the dining room, refreshing our customers' silver teapots, when a white middle-aged woman reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a colorful hardcover. Have you read this book? It's so good. The Joy Luck Club, the recently released novel that featured a bunch of old, sassy Chinese ladies who liked to eat, gossip, and play mahjong, could easily have been set in our back kitchen. Every time I came in to help at the restaurant, another diner, usually older and female, cited the most memorable characters, lines, and scenes. They all wanted to know if I was working on something similar. I was writing poetry, but they didn't care. To them, all writers were the same. They would squeal, you could be the next Amy Tan. My mom turned out to be the biggest pusher. She rarely had a book in her hand, but the success of the Joy Luck Club convinced her that her life was a bestseller too. She followed me around the dining room, dropping stories from her childhood, the same ones I'd heard growing up, but now she recounted them as if she was auditioning for her own books on tape. One night, after seeing how our waiters sometimes pooled their tips together, my mom shared an oldie. When the communists marched south, they targeted my family. My uncles and grandpa were rich in America, so the Red Guard called us traitors. My stubborn grandma didn't want to leave her big home, so when my parents escaped to Hong Kong, they left me behind to keep her company. The communists hated me and my pawpaw. When I was 4, they made us watch as they forced my grandma to climb the old banyan tree in our courtyard. Then they pushed her off into a pile of broken glass. For a visual, my mom rubbed her knees. Another time, standing at the water station, she launched into her own nautical tale. When I was 5, my uncle in America paid $25,000 in renminbi, a king's ransom in people's money, to local fishermen to ferry our remaining family out of China. After a long ride tucked under the planks of his fishy fishing boat, we came up for air. But we weren't in Hong Kong. The trader had turned us into the authorities. In jail, I had to sing Communist Party songs to earn extra rice for me and my grandma. Another chapter came as we stood beneath the painting of a Chinese countryside. When my papa and I were freed from jail, we found that the officials had given away our home to peasants. We were forced to live several villages away in a dirt hut with 3 other families. Whenever we went out for a pail of water, my grandma had to bend low to keep her head below the soldiers. Once again, she gave me a demonstration, this time bowing her head. Granted, my mom's epic saga interested me. Who wouldn't be intrigued by tales of prison cells, guns, and stolen ransoms? Even the parts about her mundane life in Hong Kong after she was reunited with her parents and siblings were amusing. But these were her stories, not mine. She had to tell them, not me. I was in school to find my own voice. I sat and listened, but that was as far as it would go. Toward the end of the summer, as I was at the back table sipping my red pop, stockpiling poems for the upcoming semester, my mom sat down. Before I could say anything, she started talking. I was a top student in Hong Kong. When Pepsi came to town, they held a big contest for students to draw a picture of their own school. Mine was the best at Sacred Heart. I won 6 cases. There were so many bottles, I had to give some to the nuns. I threw down my Parker pen, the one I treated myself to after getting into the program. Yes, and they kept burping all day. It was so funny. You've told me that story over and over, and I don't even like Pepsi. I prefer Coke. My mom's shoulders shriveled. The shine faded from her rosy cheeks. You don't want to hear my story? I tensed up. I do, but I'm behind on my own stuff. Between working at Drake's, the Journal, and saving the world, my schedule was packed. On top of that, my workshops in the fall were advanced. Still insecure about my place in the program, I put pressure on myself to create more interesting writing by staying up late and scribbling in my notebook every detail of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, working harder could not produce a better poem. My mom lifted herself off her seat. The glint in her eyes orphaned me. Her 42 years of life flashed before my eyes. She'd gone from Guangzhou to Hong Kong to Detroit and spent the past 2 decades raising her 6 children in a hostile foreign land. She tried to prove that her life had worth, that it hadn't gone unnoticed, and here I was, the ungrateful son, writing it off. Her lips quivered in a soft murmur. I hastily picked up my pen, backtracking. Go ahead, Mom. I'll write it down this time. My mom bowed her head as if I were one of the soldiers holding a gun to her temple, ordering her to sing. No, you go on. You do your own thing. I reached out my hand, but by then she'd disappeared through the black swinging door, leaving only the rattling from the kitchen, the clanging woks and rumbling dishwasher. I sat there upset at myself for being so inconsiderate. Everything I'd done in the past 3 years had been for her, but it seemed as though I had failed the final test. My education wasn't just to help me get a better life, it was for my whole family. We were a team. We were the 8 immortals. How could I let them down? I needed to make things right, but I knew that, like most disappointments in our house, apologies were never spoken. Only deeds would bring about reconciliation. So,
Oh, powerful, powerful stuff.
it's for my
Um,
mom.
yeah, yeah. So her story does get told.
It
Even
took
maybe
30 years.
in your college years, you're like, oh, do I have to hear it one more time? But it got in the book. So
Yeah, it took 30 years, but
yeah. Yeah,
that's why I like to read that story.
yeah. Um, you mentioned before we started the passage, you said the context of Detroit. I'd like to like pivot and turn towards discussion of Detroit back in the 80s and some of the really significant things that were going on there. Um, and one of the things that comes out in the book is also your family's personal connection to Vincent Chen,
Mm,
and how that is a significant, tragic, but also significant point in history for kind of the Asian Americans and civil rights and Asian Americans finding their voice. Um,
mm.
And so, can you talk a little bit about where the restaurant was located in Detroit? Was it always in the same location or did it move? And how that location changed over time. Because at some point, Detroit was kind of in its heyday, right? But then the city starts to decline and the restaurant is in a certain part of town. So, can you paint that picture for those of us who know really nothing about Detroit?
Sure. I'll talk about Detroit's Chinatown, and then I'll talk about Vincent Chin later.
Okay.
If you ask me again.
Okay.
Detroit had a Chinatown, because it was Detroit's. In some ways, it's like a boom town, right? Like you guys in the West, here. I mean, the auto industry really, made the city like boom. By the time you reach 1950, it was like the fifth largest city in the United States with almost 2 million people. I had 1.8 million people, right? And keep in mind, our restaurant was opened in 1940. So we saw that heyday, that growth, right? It was all like when my family moved there, like in the late 1800s, it was still a really French city, right? Because it was founded by the French. But then the auto industry completely changed it because you had all these people, moving there for work and jobs. And so in that world, pre-1950, the Chinatown in Detroit was located near the Irish community of Corktown. And that Chinatown was, people say it was as many as 4,000 people, right? With, 100 businesses. But like most of the cities in America, they suffered white flight, in the 50s and 60s. And when a lot of those white residents left town, they moved to the suburbs. And what the cities did was they built these freeways to connect the former residents with their jobs downtown. And what they ended up doing was they were destroying a lot of communities, in particular communities of color, right, who didn't have the power to say, "Hey, wait, don't." And so that's what happened to the Chinatown in Detroit. They demolished it to make way for a freeway. And so the city tried to recreate a new Chinatown a few blocks away, and they tried to create it as this international district, but it never really took off because the Chinese community took that as an opportunity to sort of move out to the suburbs themselves. So they sort of followed that white flight out at that same time. And so the Chinatown that I grew up in was in this second location, which they called New Chinatown. And that one never had more than three or 400 people, I think. It just, so if you think about it, it was like 90% loss in terms of the size of the Chinatown. And it was a little bit more Pan-Asian because, like I said, the city tried to make it a Pan-Asian community. So there were like a lot of Filipinos and Indians who lived in that area too, to create that. And so that's sort of where I grew up. It's the corner of Cass and Peterborough. If you look at police statistics, it was the most crime-ridden neighborhood in the city of Detroit. So people will say like, I'll say like, I grew up in the bad part of Detroit, and people are like, "What? Detroit had a bad part?" Assuming like the whole city was bad. And yeah, the whole city was bad, but there were actually some neighborhoods which were worse than others. And so we were in one of those bad neighborhoods. I mean, just going by police statistics, it was a really, really tough neighborhood. But like I said, we had this wonderful Chinese restaurant where my parents, you just felt really safe, coming in. And I never really feared things growing up in that area. I don't know why. Maybe because my family was there. I don't.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how your family adapted to the change and to the crime that they found,
Well, I mean,
around the city, or they just coped with it maybe. Maybe they didn't adapt. It was just like coping.
yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think when you have that mentality where you're doing so much for your family, right? You're sacrificing, you put up with things like that.
Mm.
Put up with things where someone like me, who has a little bit more privilege, right? Because you know, I got to go to college, you know what I mean? I have a little more privilege than my parents. Maybe I have a lower tolerance for discrimination and crime and stuff like that versus when you're more an immigrant or you're more working class, I think you put up a little bit more, right?
Mm.
Because you still have this goal in life of like, I'm going to do this for my family. And so I say this in the book, you know, when I talk about like my first relatives coming to America and saying like, they faced a lot of discrimination. And how did they feel about that, right? Like, did they ever think that they should have demanded that job working in the factory, right? Or did they just accept it that that's part of moving to a new country is that you accept a certain percentage of discrimination, right? As part of your life. But versus say someone like me who's born in the United States is like, I don't have that expectation that I should accept these inequalities. I have a expectation of full, membership or whatever you might say, your
Mhm.
citizenship, as an
Right,
American.
right,
And that's something that my parents always instilled in us is like, you guys are fully American. You should, expect everything, that this country has to offer. And, people don't often ask me this, but I do have a favorite line in the book.
uh-huh,
And my favorite line is, I say that, uh, um, yes, my family succeeded because of America, but America also succeeded because of my family. It's a
right,
it's a two-way thing, right? Like
right,
immigrants come here, they put in a lot of work and effort, and they benefit from all that this wonderful country has to offer. But part of the reason this country is so wonderful is because it gives these opportunities, right? It's a two-way street, and we can't
right,
forget that as a country.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, America is built on the the dedication, hard work, perseverance, resilience of the working, class of all the immigrants who came here. And so we
Yeah, and I would say, like, the discrimination that my great grandfather, whoever was the first that came here, is probably the same or similar to the ones that I faced, which is like, oh, you're a foreigner, oh, you can't assimilate, or like in the case of COVID, you carry diseases. These are the same stereotypes that they had from the original Chinese that first came here. It hasn't changed, right? Um, you know, uh, and I think what has changed is sort of our community and how we can respond to these things. But one thing I do say, and I don't know if this is controversy or not, but when you live in a multicultural society like America, um, you have to expect that there's a certain amount of discrimination because we are all coming from different backgrounds with different values and different understandings and expectations. We're not going to completely know everything about each other, right? But when that happens, when you find that you don't know something about someone, do you see that as an opportunity to learn and grow, or do you see that as a opportunity to build a wall and to like discriminate or put a us versus them thing? And so for me, the upside of living in a multicultural society where we can learn from each other and experience different things, whether it's just food or culture or religion, whatever the upside of a multicultural society, for me, outweighs the downside of the occasional racist act or the occasional, sexism or anti-religion, whatever. But the question is, we can still grow and get better and use
Mhm,
these opportunities to learn. But it is something that, that's what happens when you meet people who are different,
mhm.
you know. And that's
Right,
okay. If you take these opportunities as a learning lesson, then it's okay, you know.
right, right,
Yeah.
right. Um, we're kind of winding down our time, and we've got a slew of questions that I see people are starting to ask. I did want you to share a little bit about your personal and your family's connection to Vincent Chin, because that was a really, I think, significant point in your life in which it, that you observed what was going on around you, the voice of the Asian Americans advocating the civil, not it wasn't necessarily civil rights, but the whole advocacy for attention to Asian Americans in the community, what was going on, how the stereotype of Asians just being voiceless or being ignored. Um, and that I think helped you find a voice as somebody who talks about civil rights and social injustice and things like that. And then you later made a documentary video. I can't remember what 2012 or something. So I wanted to highlight those points of your life.
Yeah, so it's been this recurring theme in my life, that story. So prior to the Vincent Chin murder, which I'll explain for the people here who aren't familiar with it, is that When I was growing up, I actually always thought I would just work in the family business, right? Because it was a great place to grow up. My family was there. I got all the free food I wanted. So I just thought I would probably at some point inherit or be part of the family business. But when I decided to go from being a waiter to a writer, is because of the Vincent Chin case. And what happened was that this was the start of my freshman year in high school. It's the 80s, the height of the anti-Japanese sentiment in Detroit, because of the auto industry. Japan had just overtaken the United States as the largest, auto producing country in the world. And, that led to a lot of anti-Japanese sentiments, which led to a lot of anti-Asian bias, right? Because people can't tell the difference. Vincent was a Chinese American out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He goes to the strip club. At some point, these two white auto workers come in and they're overheard saying it's because of you mother blanks that we're out of work. They're all kicked out of the bar. And these two guys get in their car and they drive around the streets of Detroit until they find Vincent sitting outside of McDonald's waiting for his ride to pick him up. They grab a baseball bat and then they bash his head in. And our families were friends, right? My uncle was his best man. And so we found out that next Saturday morning. And when you're a 14-year-old kid and you know somebody that's in the hospital fighting for their life in a coma, you're going to check the news, right? You're going to check the paper to find out how are they reporting on this story. They didn't cover it at all. The mainstream media didn't cover that story. I checked the next day, nothing again. I checked the day after that, nothing. I checked again and again and again. It took them 12 whole days before they actually reported on that. In that time period, everybody in the Chinese community were coming to our restaurant, to ask for, details because we had the gambling den in our basement. That's why everybody came to our place. But they would just ask, well, what happened? Why was he there and all this stuff? And that contrast between what our community cared about and what the mainstream media was reporting really stuck out to me because several months later, when the judge came back with the sentence, he only fined these guys $3,000 and they didn't have to serve a single day in jail. And the judge's response was, you don't put these type of people in jail, meaning white middle class people, you know what I mean, with jobs. And it just really stuck out to me that it's because I don't have a problem that the judge showed compassion for these two guys. I'm sure they didn't start off their day thinking they were going to kill somebody, but the fact is they did do it, right? And something bad happened, and you do have to pay something for it. But the reason that I was upset about it was because the judge had no compassion for Vincent's family, right? And the mother's loss and the fiance's loss. And I understood why the judge would have compassion for these two guys is because the media in Detroit at that time were writing all these stories about the white auto workers and how they were losing their jobs. And so there was a lot of sympathy and a lot of compassion for these people, but there was never any stories about the Chinese American or the Asian American and what we go through. And so it really struck me at that point. It's like, well, it's because he doesn't know who we are. He doesn't know our story. And at that point, I thought, like, well, okay, well, then I'll tell our stories. And so I lugged the typewriter. You guys know what those are, typewriters, to the dining room. And I just started writing these letters to the editor, telling them, hey, write about this story, please. None of them ever did. I mean, I'm a 14-year-old kid, probably not a very good writer, but that's set me on this path of the importance of understanding why, as people in general, we just need to tell our stories and share our stories and have other people know our stories too, so that when these bad things do happen, that there isn't this unconscious bias in terms of who we see as the victims and the perpetrators, right? Who is worthy of compassion in this society, right? Who are the people that we think of as the ones that you know um are the heroes or the victor? I don't know how to better
Right,
describe it. But do you get
right,
what I'm saying? Yeah.
right,
And that's
right.
the importance of storytelling. And then that's
Hmm. Hmm.
why that's
Hmm.
why I've made it my life mission to, tell as many Asian American stories as possible.
Hmm.
Not just my own, right? Because I didn't care, but that's why I went off to New York to co-found that group called the Asian American Writers Workshop because
Right,
I felt like, you know what? It's so important for us to get as many Asian American stories out there so that God forbid if something bad happens, that people it won't be a blank slate.
right,
People
right,
see us as people worthy of compassion.
right, right. Thank you so much, Curtis,
Mhm.
for joining us today. I know we've got audience questions, and I want to allow some time for that. Um, let's see. I've got a few more things. Maybe I'll weave these in with the audience questions. So, from Sally, we know that let's see, your family arrived. So why Detroit of all cities? And I think you touched on this.
Well, I mean, so one thing was that around that time period, there was a lot of anti-Chinese discrimination on the West Coast.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, that's when they were burning down the Chinatowns and lynching the Chinese. And so there was this movement amongst those immigrants at that time to try to like blend in smaller cities where they wouldn't be attacked and they wouldn't be seen as a threat. Why they chose Canton, and it wasn't just random. It's because the guy that founded the city of Canton, Ohio, actually made his fortune by selling, importing goods from China. So I think I'm just guessing, but I'm guessing my family just assumed that, well, there must be Chinese people in that city because if you're buying Chinese goods, right? So they ended up in Canton, Ohio. And then when there wasn't really much opportunities there, Detroit was not that far from Canton. You know what I mean? So and Detroit was
Okay.
a small city at that time too. You know what I mean? So so that's how they ended up there.
Okay. Okay. Um, we have some folks in the audience asking about uh how the book is being received since it's been published. And it's been out a year and a half. I can't
Year and a half,
remember.
almost
Year-
it's October 2019. Yeah. Year and a half,
Okay.
a little over a
Okay.
year and a half. Yeah. No, I mean, so the book has done really well. I mean, I've done over 300 talks and it's already in its third printing
Oh, wow.
after just a year and a half. So it's moved really, really fast.
Mhm.
It's gotten major coverage. I don't know if you guys saw, the New York Times did a two-page profile on me. USA Today just, had something on me last week. But I've been on Washington Post, LA Times, Boston Globe, CBS Saturday Morning News did an 8-minute segment with me back in Detroit. NBC News brought me back to Detroit for a long segment, you know what I mean, stories on me. I've been on NPR, all thing PBS NewsHour. It's just been really, really wonderful. Back home, I mean, it's been really great to be embraced by an international office audience. Like I've done 9 other countries. I did my first military base in Korea, the largest U.S. military base. So it's like really kind of cool to be able to do all this stuff. But what's been really heartening is, the embracing by my hometown of my home state of Michigan. Some key highlights are like my book was picked by the state library as one of the notable books, that year. Uh, I'm currently what's called the Great Michigan Read. The Michigan Humanities Council chooses one book every 2 years, and they're supposed to buy 6,000 copies of the book and put me on a 15-state tour of the state. But because someone is trying to kill the National Endowment for the Humanities. The funding has been frozen, and so they're trying to scramble and figure out how they can honor that commitment, as part of the prize. I was supposed to give the keynote, or not the keynote, the opening talk at the National Humanities Council, but now that's also been cut. I mean, uh, but yeah, I've given so many talks in Michigan. I mean, Ford Motor Company, Kresge Foundation. I actually gave talks to both the Pistons and the Lions. And the Detroit Lions said, like, anytime I'm back home, I get free tickets to the game. The Michigan Historical Society did an exhibit, at the museum. I've given the keynote for the Michigan Historian Society of like 600 historians. So just the fact that it's been so embraced by my home state of Michigan, um, has been really, really nice because I really wrote it as a love letter to my hometown of Detroit as well. So if you pick up the book, you'll learn a lot about Detroit history, because I felt like it's such a misunderstood city, particularly that time period where all you ever heard about was like Murder City or like all these awful things that people would say. And um, I didn't experience it that way. And I wanted people to know that Detroit's a good place and it was a good place to have a childhood. It was a good place to grow up. And so and that's what people have said to me. You know, the people from Detroit, they've said, thank you for writing our story and saying it in a way that's true. Like, yeah, these bad things happened, but there was still a lot of love. There was still a lot of pride, you know, and it was really hard because, you know, the rest of the country just kept making fun of us and putting us down and, you know, just so that idea that, I really wanted to show this other side of Detroit was important to me, and
Right, right. In another interview I watched with you, I can't remember if the other person said it or if you said it, but it had to do with Detroit always being picked on because of the issues that the city was facing. And I did notice in your email address, it's like Curtis from Detroit, and
part of it,
you
yeah.
you talked also about like wearing sweatshirts or something that said something like from Detroit or proud to be Detroit. And so in a way, it's like, yeah, you've also become an advocate for the city as a whole.
Oh yeah, no, I've been going around. I mean, I spend half the time talking about Detroit that I talk about the book, and it's such a great place. The one I don't know if you saw in this one in the interviews, but I love telling this one story. Is I did this one event in Cambridge, Massachusetts,
Mhm.
and it was a packed reading at a bookstore. And at the end of it, this 60-year-old white woman gets up and she's like, "Has anybody here eaten at Chung's?" And nobody had because we're in Massachusetts. But she said, I grew up in Detroit. Your family's restaurant was my favorite restaurant growing up. We went there every Sunday night, and I just loved it. And she said, I told my mom that I was going to this reading by one of the kids from Chung's. And she said her mom, who has dementia now, started recounting all of our dishes in vivid details. And this woman said, for the first time in years, that she felt like she had her mom back. And that was really powerful to me because growing up, I always knew that my parents were working really, really hard and sacrificing for us, for our family. What I didn't really appreciate as much was how they were sacrificing for other people's families too, giving them an opportunity to have a good meal in Detroit because as I said before, a lot of the, city was just shutting down, like businesses were closing left and right. There were fewer and fewer options of places to go just for a nice normal meal, right? Where you didn't feel threatened or whatever. And the fact that my parents were working so hard to keep that alive and to keep that memory of that past Detroit, it's just something that's just really made me appreciate their sacrifices so much more. And the sacrifices of businesses, even like the Golden Horse, do you know what I mean? They're
Right, in Portland, right. Hmm.
part of the community. These small businesses are so important to the fabric, not just to the families that run them, but really to the community as a whole.
Hmm. Hmm.
Why we have to recognize that and we have to support these small businesses, and so yeah, that
Yeah.
was very moving for me.
Hmm. Were there times throughout, maybe towards the latter part of the history of the restaurant, that the family faced a dilemma or the decision of relocating to the suburbs or closing?
Oh, they
Um,
did. They opened up a second location in the suburb. And so that's actually what the next book is about.
oh,
So in 2005, I was writing for the Disney Channel. I came out to Hollywood. I became a TV writer. And I was writing for the Disney Channel, and I get this terrible phone call that my parents are in a car accident. And sadly, my dad died, and my mom was severely injured. And my brother Chris, who in this book is the golden child, because
yes.
every Chinese family has a golden child. He's our child. He's our golden child. He's a doctor in Los Altos Hills. He immediately whisks my mom off to the Bay Area to help her recuperate. By the end of that week, all of my siblings decided they were also going to move to the Bay Area to help my mom. And I was left behind in Detroit trying to decide, do I go back to Hollywood and continue this pursuit of TV writing, which wasn't a great place. There weren't a lot of opportunities for Asian writers back then. Or do I stay in Detroit and take over this fabulous Chinese restaurant that my great grandfather founded? And so that book is called Leftovers, and
Uh,
that's what I'm working on right now.
well, thank you for sharing a little bit about what's coming next. That was kind of one of my questions as well. So we definitely look forward to that. Yeah, and I was also wondering about your siblings. Where are they now? Had they ever been like a part of maintaining the restaurant? Uh,
No, I mean
sounds
that.
like no. Sounds like they all
No.
went on to their own careers.
Yeah, and if when you read the next book, if you decide to read the next book, you'll that is a point of contention to some degree because I didn't understand why nobody else was trying to,
I think step forward and
step forward and preserve his legacy. Do you know what I mean? Um,
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know. Everybody's different.
Well,
Maybe it was.
it's tough, and if you have your own interests that are elsewhere, and you want to pursue and be successful there, and you see a struggling restaurant, how can you envision success if that's not where your passion really lies? So
Yeah, and I tend
it's
to be a bit of a Pollyanna. I tend to be a little overly optimistic sometimes, but
yeah,
sometimes that works for me. I guess generally it does work for me. Do you know what I mean? But maybe
right.
not everybody. Um,
Right.
you
No, there has to be people
know,
who see the good and have that hope, right? Um, so one of our audience members asks, like, she can envision your book being adapted into a movie. And if it was adapted into a movie, or in those discussion phases, who would you advocate for playing you or the other members of your family or associates in the book? Have you ever thought about that?
we've had some interest, but not any really serious interest.
Uh-huh,
So
uh-huh.
I'll be honest with you, I just haven't really put much effort into it because
Okay, okay.
people, for people who haven't read the book, I spent a good part of my childhood as a young Republican.
Uh-huh.
I was like class president of the high school. I co-founded the Students Against Smoking, the Young Republican Club. I was National Honor Society president.
Well, in the
Margaret
80s, that
Thatcher.
was like the movement of so many youth. So
Yeah, so I don't necessarily know if I want to see that character on TV.
I see.
So I was like, but I do have a couple meetings coming up here in LA, but
Okay.
but I truthfully want this next book, Leftovers, to be the TV show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Um,
now that piqued our interest even more to
well, because it's that show, The Bear.
oh, you're right, right.
Bear set in a Chinese restaurant, or more apt to my age, an old show called 6 Feet Under, which was on for
Mm.
a long time.
Mhm,
You know,
mhm.
So I feel like that's the show that I would want to write.
Ah,
Older
okay,
character, older voice.
okay,
That's the one I would like to be a TV show. Yeah.
okay.
And then in that
Um,
sense, I said like, oh, people ask me, who do you want to play you? And I was like, oh, Harry Shum Jr. And then my friends were like, no, who do you want to play you? Not who do you want to be your husband?
oh,
Yeah. So,
right, right, right. Um, let's see here. Let's see. We haven't really talked about it or in the course of our discussion, but one of our audience members who sounds like has read the book or is familiar with it writes, how did your experience as a gay Asian American in Detroit differ from other parts of the country? Was the question.
um,
I'm
well, it's hard for me to say, but I do think that there were several things that sort of define my experiences that
uh-huh,
more so
uh-huh.
that I'm from the 80s, I'm from the AIDS generation.
Right,
I
right.
feel like I talked to other people from this generation, and it really was this fatalistic idea of like, we're not going to live long,
Okay,
and you've
okay.
really got to prioritize what you want in life, right?
Mm,
Really, really because you're just never guaranteed anything. So I think in that sense, that's why I don't have a fear of failure in some ways.
mhm. Okay.
People always say like, oh, like you go into these really careers where the success rate is so low. Like,
Mhm.
you ever worry about that? And I said, no, I never did because I think of the people that never even got a chance to try. So like, why would I be disappointed if I don't get a job or if something's not working out? Because I mean, at least I got to try. At least I had the opportunity. So I think that defines me more so, like being part of
Mhm.
the age generation in terms of the racial aspect, because there's always this thing like when you're someone like me, like who's, gay, Asian, Buddhist, working
Mhm.
class, like everything sort of defines you as the outsider in some way.
Mhm. Mhm.
And all of these things sort of play out differently. So like being, Asian growing up in the Midwest is really quite different than growing up Asian in Hawaii or growing up Asian here, like California or Seattle, right? Where there are larger Asian communities where you do have a stronger sense of that. I do say that one thing about like being Asian and the coming out process might be a little bit different is that when you in America, the coming out process is billed as this epic hero's journey, right? Like the Joseph Campbell story of like, you find a mission, and your mission is you're coming out and you got to fight all these battles to be yourself, right? It's very like, like centered that way. But I don't think that's the same way that I experience it because I'm Asian, and maybe this is stereotypical, but I think that Asians oftentimes think of individual decisions in terms of how they impact the family and the community to a larger degree. And so for me, even though I knew that I was gay, I didn't come out until I was in my mid 20s. And that's not because I was afraid that my parents would kick me out or disown me, because we're Buddhists, we don't have an issue with that. But I didn't come out to them because I felt like I was protecting them, because I felt like they were already living such a stressful life, running that business in Detroit. And again, anytime you read anything about a gay person, they would be dead soon, right? Because of AIDS. I didn't want to put that burden on my family. I didn't want them to have to worry about me being out in the world. And so I feel like me staying in the closet was actually, I don't want to say heroic act, but it was definitely a selfless act, right?
Right.
Like I withheld a part of me because I felt like it would have messed up the family dynamic a little bit, in an unnecessary
Hmm.
way. Um,
Right. It would have put in your framework, it almost sounds like you felt like it would have added an extra layer of burden and worry on your family that has so many things that they're worrying about and
yeah, and I didn't
struggling
want
with.
to include
And
that.
now they have the worry of like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to our son? We've heard all these tragic
Exactly.
stories.
But the way the narrative is oftentimes said in America is like, oh, you have to come out because that's what you have to do. You can't be in the closet because
Right.
otherwise you're not living your full life.
Right. Be true to yourself and let others know that. Yeah.
But I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
and this is something I said, earlier about like, well, what are the life lessons I learned growing up in that Chinese restaurant? And the conclusion I came to this was like, yes, everything has timing. Like you
Right.
know when to bring the soup out, you know when to bring
Mm-hmm.
the bill out, you know when to give
Mm-hmm.
them the fortune cookie, just like
Mm-hmm.
you know when to come out. There is a right time and a wrong time, and you shouldn't feel like you are under this pressure that you have to because otherwise you're less than a whole being. I don't know. So maybe part of being Asian or Asian culture
Mm-hmm.
influences my thinking on that a little bit. Maybe that
Yeah.
might be a little bit.
In a way, I kind of think so. And I had a conversation with my husband last night about this. Um, my husband, for those who in the audience who don't know, he is uh what should I say? Ethnically, he is Korean, but he was born in Japan. So his family has an immigrant story going to Japan, similar to like Chinese Americans coming
Yeah.
to America. So being an ethnic minority in Japan,
Mhm.
and he grew up in a family restaurant also.
Oh, really?
Um, and then layered with that, there was a family member who everybody probably thought or in the back of their mind knew was gay, but nobody ever talked about it. And
Hmm.
so I was asking my husband about his take as an
Hmm.
Asian person
Hmm.
on kind of the, the, the gay experience or why um, Asians don't talk about it from his own experience. And he's like, yeah, we just don't dwell on it. It was just never brought up. We just accepted them. Um, and maybe in the back of people's mind, people might have thought, oh, it's a phase or something. But he said within the cultural context, it was just never openly talked about at all. And so he thought that maybe uh, how you talk about your experience in your book, how you get your ears pierced or you did something subtly and no one ever mentioned it. Nobody ever brought it up, even though they probably observed it. It was just something we don't talk about. Um, and
Yeah.
so he was like, he saw a parallel there with kind of the deeper Asian culture. Um,
Yeah, I don't want to make it seem like it's a failure if you stay in the closet because
mhm,
I'll make
mhm.
individual choices,
Right, right, right,
right? You know what I mean?
right. Right. And when I experienced life with my husband's family and knew this member, I didn't see it as a failure. I just thought it very an interesting dynamic and very different than how often it is in the United States, in which people are like very proud and out. And it was, and I'm sure that also might exist in Japan.
Yeah,
It
but
was
that's
because
not the only way. That's not the only way to celebrate being gay.
exactly, exactly, or to celebrate or acknowledge identity, right? There's other ways.
Yeah, there are
So
other. Mhm.
right, right. I don't want to really end on this particular topic. Some questions came up in the audience is like, for readers, for especially the young readers, what are the key takeaways do you hope that this book really? And for me, when I read it, it's like, oh wow, there's so much going on. It's hard for me to identify any like one thing because there's so much. But in your mind, what are the key things that you might want to re-highlight that we haven't talked on, or anything else?
No, I mean, it was just it was a fun read. It was a fun write for me, and
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
nice family, and
Yeah,
dealing with this stuff. So I just hope they have an enjoyable time reading it.
right.
If you're a restaurant kid yourself, that maybe you see something in there that you can relate to. For those who don't, who didn't have my life experience, maybe you can see something that you can connect with. You know what I mean? And that's what I think literature does, right? It just, it allows us to peer into other people's worlds and lives and hopefully find a way to connect with your own life, I think. So that's what I would say. You know,
Right.
eh,
Well, I also see the book as, it's a restaurant, which is a gathering place. People are enjoying food together, but it's also a place where we can experience new things, we can learn new things, bringing together different people because the Chinese restaurant, the clientele is all walks of life, especially if you're in an undesirable part of town.
yeah.
And so you observe so much. And so I think there's just a lot of like
Well, I say
to have conversation about in your book.
I try to treat this as like a Chinese banquet. There's a little bit of something for everybody. There's fun stories, there's serious stories and things like that. And like I was just saying, like, what do I hope from the reader? I guess it really depends. One thing's interesting to me is that, I've always grown up as Asian American. Like I have a really strong sense of that, what it means creatively, artistically, personally, professionally, politically. But one thing I didn't realize was that there's this other community that I'm part of, which is the Chinese diaspora, which I never really felt part of because I don't speak the language. I don't have any relatives in China. I never felt particularly connected to China versus being Asian American. I feel totally Asian American, right? But now that I've traveled around and I've met all these people, from different places like Suriname and Mauritius and Antwerp, who say like, your story of growing up in a Chinese restaurant is the same as mine. I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, in South Africa. And to me, it's opened my eyes to this idea that there is this other community that I didn't really, was never interested in really pursuing or thinking about, which is the Chinese diaspora internationally. And so one of the other projects I'm working on um, is a coffee table book of Chinese restaurants from around the world,
Oh,
which would be really, really fun, to sort of see how that immigration changed, but also how the food is different in each of these different places. So I think I'm going to prioritize that over the Chinese restaurant doc series
ah,
because part of that is it just takes so much money to raise. And given the anti-DEI climate right now in the
uh-huh.
United States, a lot of the funding sources where I would have normally approached are no longer available. So I have to pivot and maybe do something that's a little bit more affordable. And a coffee table book, I think, is a little bit more, affordable. So I'll have to do that. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Right, right. I mean, in my own career, I have had the opportunity to meet uh, folks from Asian immigrant backgrounds from Germany or South America. And it's just been fascinating to hear their own stories, compare and contrast that with those
Mhm.
of the American Asian experience. And they're also very keen to know about like what's it like as an Asian in America. And to compare it with their own. So yeah. And then there was something more recently I saw on TV, and I can't remember exactly now what country it was, maybe it was Japan, but it had to do with immigrants from Italy, but it was talking about how the diaspora was very different for the immigrants who came to the United States versus the immigrants who ended up going to South America. And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
something we hadn't really thought about. And that's also probably the same with the Chinese diaspora, is
Yeah.
there's significant key differences in the push and pulls that took them to different. Um,
So I want to explore that in this.
yeah. So that sounds fascinating, very fascinating. Um, well, I know time is running out. You have another engagement to get to. So thank you so much, Curtis, for being our guest today, for sharing your book with us, but more importantly, informing our audience of the Asian American experience through your families and your personal story.
Yeah,
Uh,
please follow me on Instagram or, sign up for my mailing list. Go to my website, Curtis from Detroit. I also forgot to mention, I actually am in the midst of all my traveling and all this stuff. I actually am about to finish another film for PBS.
oh,
So,
okay,
yeah, I'm about a week away from it. But type in this guy's name if you get a chance. His name is
okay.
Warren King,
Warren King. Okay.
Warren King,
Uh-huh. King.
King. He's a
Okay.
Taiwanese American artist. But look at his stuff.
Okay.
You take a quick look at his stuff.
Okay. So for our audience, we're going to put links to all of these kinds of resources and past interviews and things up on our uh, First Saturday PDX website
Mhm.
related to today's talk. So you'll be able to see all kinds of these resources and other things related to Curtis. So thank you again, Curtis. I know you
Thank you.
got to jump off and get on to your other gig. Have a wonderful Saturday afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.